Hello and welcome back to the Python Beginners Plus course. In this tutorial, we take a look at progressing our knowledge from the previous tutorial where we looked at building a Tkinter GUI interface, and we're going to connect it to an SQLite database in this tutorial. So that we're super clear what's going to happen here, we're going to build a simple interface with some inputs and then go ahead and in our code create a new database. Here we're using SQLite database, so there's no installs, everything should just work. And then we'll go ahead and build a simple interface so that we can add items to the database from our graphical or GUI interface. So this is the final product here. We've got our nice interface here. And we're going to add in some, in this case, new users. You can change this to whatever you like. So let's add a new user, username and password. We've added a new user. If we happen to try and enter a user that already exists, then it's going to say username already exists. All right, so let's get started. Right, so let's start off by building our interface with Tkinter. So from Tkinter as import. This time we're just going to import all. So previously we used as TK. So let's just show the other way that you might see other people utilizing. So we're just going to import everything. And the first thing, if you remember, if you have seen the previous tutorial, is we're going to make a window. So that's going to be the window interface that we're going to specify so we can place other elements onto it so that we can put some input forms, for example, so we can type some text and then eventually that will go into the database. So let's go ahead and activate that. So once that's done, let's now go ahead and set out the geometry of our window. So we want to set the size of this. So let's go for example, 450. By 180, so that's going to be the size of our window that we're going to make. Now we can quickly test that, of course, if you remember. Let's go ahead and run that window.main loop. Okay, so let's just give this a go. Here we go. Just bring this in. There we go. So that's what we've just built here. We've built, brought in the Tkinter tools. We've initiated a new instance, so that we can then specify our window geometry, 450 by 180. And that's what we're looking at here. And then we've started the application utilizing window.main loop. So that fires everything off. And now we have an interface. So next up, let's have a look at now building our database so that we can actually store some data in our database. So here in Visual Studio Code, if we go down into the extensions, I do have, which will make it easier for you, SQLite installed. And that's just going to allow us to inspect the database and all the data inside of it. So go ahead and install that. And let's just go back to the code here. Right. So next up then, we're going to need our database. So let's import SQLite. So this is a lightweight database, which we can utilize to store data. Right, so that imports our database. So we now have our database we can work with. So what we're going to need to do here is, well, we're going to need to make a database, right? So let's go ahead and try this. Now we don't need to actually physically, or we don't need to actually initiate a database here on the right hand side. We can do that with the code, right? So let's go ahead and use with. So with SQLite or SQLite 3, let's go ahead and try and connect to our database, which doesn't exist yet. So this is going to build a new database. So let's just call this, for example, details or whatever you want to call it, .db. So that's going to be our database file. And now we're going to connect, or we're going to be able to access that as db. Okay, so that's going to provide here a connection, or it's going to build a database initially, and we're going to then utilize this whenever we need to connect to a database and store data, of course, or collect data from the database. So we're going to utilize or reference that as DB whenever we want to connect to the database or send data to the database. Right, so let's bring in the cursor. So a way to explain this, what we're doing here is db.cursor. So I'm accessing our database here through db, and I'm getting what is known as the cursor. Right, so this is basically going to allow me access to the database and to save data and to collect data from the database. So basically I'm going to use this. So db cursor. So basically what I've done here is I've created a database, or that will create a database, and I'm going to access that database through db. And I go into db, which is kind of storing all the database, and then I'm going inside of there and get the cursor, and that cursor is going to allow me, like I said, to access or execute queries on the database so we can store data. So I'm saving that as cursor. So now I'm going to use this word or this variable we've set up here, cursor, whenever I want to access the database. For example, save things to the database. Right, so now we've got that in place. Let's just go ahead and run. And you can see straight away we do run our application still, but we now have a database. So if you do have the extension SQLite installed, what we can do now is right click, and then we can go to open database here, and you can see that we have a database. There's nothing inside of it at the moment. We're going to need to build some tables, of course, in a minute, but we do have our database now available, and we can now go ahead and, like I said, let's make some tables. All right, so I appreciate that you may not know anything about databases at all. So we're going to need to use some SQL code here to create some tables. So in our database, there'll be a table. That table will have some fields where we'll be able to store some data. So we're going to need cursor in order to perform this action. And then what we're going to do is we're going to execute an SQL statement, a command on our database to build some tables. So let's do that. Execute. And now we're going to send or use a SQL statement. We're going to wrap it here in the triple quotes here. So we're going to create a new table. So create table if not exists. Okay, so I don't want to keep creating a table. If it already exists, then we just simply won't run this command. Yeah, exists. Oh, I'll spell this right. Exists. Okay, so create table. Apologies. Create table if not exists. And the table we want to make in this case is users. So I'm going to make a table called users. We're going to have, for example, 2 fields in our table. So let's go ahead now and build that up. So inside my table, I've got an ID field. That's going to be an integer, so a whole number. And it's going to be a primary key. So it's a unique field. So you can't have duplicate items in here. And what we're going to do is we're going to make that primary key, and then it's going to be auto incrementing. Okay, so that means that anytime I add anything to the database, a new field, this is just going to auto increment, for example, by 1. So we'll see that in action. So increment. Right, so we've got that. So we've got our first field. It's called ID. It's going to be an integer type, so a whole number. It's going to be a primary key. So it's going to be a unique field, and it's going to auto increment. So every time I add something to the database, it's just going to add 1 to it. So for example, the first record here is going to be 1, the second record is going to be 2, and so on. Right, so now I use comma because I want to add a new field. So this is going to be username. It's going to be, let's just text, for example. And then it's not null. So the user has to type in something, else that won't work. So I've just used text there. That's probably not the best type, but that's going to work in this instance. So password, same again, text. It just makes sense. If you've not ever utilized SQL before, text makes sense to you, right? It's just text. So we're now going to save a password as text and then not null. So again, we're saying not null because we don't want a user to be able to make a username and password without entering one or the other. So not null. Right, so once we're done with that, let's finish off with the semicolon. I'm going to press Alt and Z So we can just wrap that, a soft wrap here so we can see the whole thing. And there we go. That's our SQL statement. So create a table if it doesn't exist, users. And we're going to create 3 fields, ID, username, and password. Right. So if we fire this off now, we would like to have expected it to had worked. We've got a problem here, potentially. Attribute error. Bulletin function or method object has no attribute execute. So after much soul searching, I found the issue. Okay, so we're going to need the parentheses there. So cursor. Right, so now with that in place, let's go ahead and run that. You can see our database has been built and our application is started, but let's go into this. So right click now, open the database. Remember, you're going to need the extension installed, the MySQL extension. And now I can see I've got a table. Excellent. So inside of my table, I have 3 fields where I'm going to store some data, ID, username, and password. Right, so our database is now set up for us to now add some information to it. So let's go ahead and finish our interface here. So we're going to need 2 inputs. So we start off with a label, of course, label 1. It's going to be a label. So we're going to borrow this from the Tkinter package. And it's going to be text, enter username. So we built a simple label. That's going to be a piece of text that's going to appear above our input. And then we're just going to place that onto our window. Here, X and Y. So X from the left to the right, Y from the top to bottom. That's the business positioning there of it. And then we're going to have a background of light green. And I'm just going to remove any padding on the left and right, padding X. So next up, let's actually add the input. So I'm going to call this username. This is going to be an entry. So where I can add some text, in this case, the username. And then I'm going to place that onto my window. So X and Y again. I'm going to give it a width of 200, height of 25. And there we go. So let's just go ahead and run this. Have a look, see what it looks like. And there we go. So now we can do the same thing for the password. So let's call this label 2. So these variable names have to be different, of course. So this is label 2. This is going to be enter password. And now we'll just position this again like we did the first label. And I'm going to give it a light green background for no particular reason. And just remove any padding on the left and right. And then same again, password is going to be an entry. Text by default, there's nothing there. And then I'm going to place it onto our window, X, Y, width, and height. And let's just give this a go. Again, so we'll run this again. You can now see we have username and password. So the final step here then, we're going to need a button. So let's create a new variable button. We're going to use the button from the Tkinter package and then text add command. And we're going to connect this to a function shortly called add new user. So that doesn't exist at the moment, but let's just go ahead and place this button onto our window. And let's just go ahead and build this function in preparation. So I'm going to build this just above here, our window. So this is going to be a function. I'm just going to put a placeholder in place, pass, just so it can still work for now. Okay, so we've added a command here. So when we press the button, it's going to fire off this function here called add user, add new user. Right, so let's just give this a go, and there we go. Right, so let's build out some of this functionality that we're going to need to actually collect the data from our form, prepare it, and then send it to the database so it saves to the database. Right, so we know here that when we press this button here, it's going to fire off this command or this function. So this function is going to start. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to collect the text from the inputs, from the 2 inputs, in this case, the 2 entries, so the username and password. So we need to collect that first. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's go for a new new username equals username dot get. Okay, so the username is a reference to this variable here, username. So we're just storing data in a variable that the user's typed in. So we're just going to collect that. And then we're going to need to do the same thing again with the password equals password.get. Right, so now we've collected that data. Now we need to prepare that data and send it to the database. Right, so we're going to need our cursor again and execute. So we can execute, fire off an SQL statement. All right, so let's do that. So we're going to select, first of all, we're going to check to see if, for example, there is a user already in the database. So we're going to use a select. So we're going to select something from the database, but we're going to select and count all. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're setting up a command. We're going to select everything in the database, and then we're going to count it. So what are we going to count? So we're going to count from users. Okay, so that's the name of the table, remember? So basically we're selecting everything and counting everything from the users table at this point. But we don't want to select and count everything. We only want to count where the username is equal to, for example, the username that was typed in. Okay, so that's going to be important. So let's go ahead and do that. So we need to, from this point, we need to grab the username. Okay, so plus new username. This is where it gets a little bit tricky because of the syntax. It is just need to be careful. So here we're just trying to utilize the data from this variable. So just be careful with this syntax, plus and then double single. Okay, so we've opened up with a single and then a double, a plus, and then the actual data plus. Okay, so that's that done. And then we want to get the result. So that looked a little bit tricky. Let's get the result, which is going to be cursor.fetch. In this case, we just want to fetch 1. So we're going to be returning, in this case, 1 item. So there should only be one. If we make a match with a user, there should only be 1 item that's returned. So here we're going to use cursor fetch 1. Now, if there was multiple items, we would probably not use fetch 1. You can see that there's a few options here. Fetch all, and that allows us then to iterate over multiple items if we did return them. But here we're just going to use fetch 1. Right. Okay, so what we've done here then is we selected everything from a database where, from the users table, where the username equals whatever the user's typed in. So here we're just going to check to make sure that there's no user with the same username. If there is, then we can do something about it. Right, so this result is stored in this variable called result. So what we've done now is we've executed this query, and now we're returning it here into this result variable. So if we did make a match, we'll be able to work that out. How we can work that out, in actual fact, is if there is a match, if, for example, we typed in Bob and there was already a username called Bob, we would return 1 item from the database. So that means that if there wasn't a username called Bob in the database, we would return 0. So therefore, we can then turn this into an if statement. So it'd be an integer if result, and the first instance of that result is, for example, more than 0. So if we return result, if we return from a database a result and there's something in it, that's going to be 1. So result is going to be 1. So if it's more than 0, it means, well, we've got an error here, because it means that there's an item in the database that matches whatever the user has typed in. So what we need to do now is create an error. Right, so we're going to need an error message. Let's just pass there for now. So let's just go back into our interface. Maybe up the top here, let's just go ahead and add a section where we're going to display an error. Okay, so let's create a new variable called error. It's going to be a message. That's going to allow me to place text in the window. It's going to have a width of 160. So the original text is going to be nothing. There's nothing inside of it. And then we're going to place it onto our window and then just give it some padding left and right of 0. So that's going to display nothing by default. But what we're going to do is that if we do receive an error, if there is a match with a username, we're going to fill this text up with something, and that's going to appear in our interface. So let's go ahead now and just finish off this if statement. So we're going to grab that error section, or that variable called error. And then what we need to do here is go ahead and in the text, we just need to update it. So that's going to equal error username already exists. Okay, so if we do make a match here, we're going to return 1, in which case it is more than 0. So therefore we're going to run this statement here, and we're going to update the error text to display error username or already exists. Cool. Now, of course, if that doesn't match, we're going to run something else, and that's obviously to save that data into the database. So we'll use the error for now. So let's just update the error text. Maybe we should call that info instead of error. And then let's type in added new user. So if the users don't match, if the username the user typed in doesn't match something that's already in the database, then we're going to say added new user, and then we just need to add the new user. So again, let's bring cursor, execute, same type of situation here. And this time we're going to insert. So we're going to run an insert SQL statement, insert into users, that's the table. And then we just need to set up the data we want to insert. So we want to insert data into username and password. Those are the two fields where we want to store data. So that's what we specified there. And now we can specify the values that we want to insert. So values. And then here we're going to use some placeholders. So I won't fully explain this. Let's just call these placeholders. Okay. And then I can go ahead and now put the data inside of it. So let's go ahead and do that. So new username. Do you remember we're storing the data originally that the user types in new username and new password. So now we're going to pass this data into the values here, which is going to then pass into these fields, and it's going to then be inserted into the database. So there's kind of a whole flow here. The format I'm using here is for security reasons. Okay, right, so there we go. So now we've done that, we just need to now commit this. So db commit. So we're going to go ahead and run this. Happy days. And that query should now run and insert the username and password into our database. Right. So there we go. That's, I think, the whole application now built. So let's give this a go. So we have username, password. So test, added new user. So let's go ahead and just try this. Let's just show this table. Now we might need to do a refresh here. So let's show the table. You can now see in our database we have a new username. So the ID, remember this was auto incrementing. So if I were to add a new user here, for example, test2, that is going to auto increment because we're not actually adding anything into this field. It's just going to auto increment for us. So I need to just refresh, right click, show table again, and there we go. We now have our second user. Excellent. Right, so let's go ahead and try out our, see if we can capture the error. So let's just type in, or let's just keep that the same. So let's just try and add in a user with the same username that already exists into our database. Press add, and now it says error, username already exists. There we go. So that works too. So we've covered quite a lot there in actual fact. Although we've just inserted into the database, of course we would want to potentially update data in the database. So the CRUD situation, create data, return data, update data, delete data. This is just an example, a simple example to help you get started and start thinking about using with Python GUI interface with working with an SQLite database. And there's a lot there, of course, because you need to know a little bit about databases. the graphical interface and Python at the same time. So there's a lot of skills that you're building upon here in order to get this working. And this was just meant to be a nice example for you to start thinking about potentially utilizing these tools. So I do hope this was useful. If it was, just let me know. Give me a thumbs up, and any suggestions, just let me know, and hopefully I'll see you in another tutorial. Thank you very much.